So we come to chapter 29. Leaving Kate for a little while, we must now pursue the history of Nicholas, which has taken a very favourable turn. The unexpected success and favour with which his experiment at Portsmouth had been received induced Mr. Crummles to prolong his stay in that town for a fortnight beyond the period he had originally assigned for the duration of his visit, during which time Nicholas personated a vast variety of characters on the stage, with undiminished success, and attracted so many people to the theatre who had never been seen there before, that a benefit was considered by the manager a very promising speculation. Nicholas assenting to the terms proposed, the benefit was had, and by it he realized no less a sum than £20. Possessed of this unexpected wealth, his first act was to enclose to honest John Browdie the amount of his friendly loan, which he accompanied with many expressions of gratitude and esteem, and many cordial wishes for his matrimonial happiness. To Newman Noggs he forwarded 1/2 of the sum he had realized, entreating him to take an opportunity of handing it on to Kate in secret, and conveying to her the warmest assurances of his love and affection. He made no mention of the way in which he had employed himself, merely informing Newman that a letter addressed to him under his assumed name at the post office, Portsmouth, would readily find him, and entreating that worthy friend to write full particulars of the situation of his mother and sister, and an account of the grand things that Ralph Nickleby had done for them since his departure from London. "You are quite out of spirits," said Smike, one night after the letter had been dispatched. No, not I," rejoined Nicholas, with assumed gaiety, for the confession would have made the poor boy miserable all night. I was thinking about my sister, Smike." "Sister?" "Aye." Is she like you?" inquired Smike. "Why, so they say," replied Nicholas, laughing. "Only a great deal more handsome." "Then she must be very, very beautiful," said Smike, after thinking a little while, with his hands folded together and his eyes bent upon his friend. "Anyone who didn't know you as well as I do, my dear fellow, would say that you were an accomplished flatterer and a courtier," said Nicholas. "I don't even know what that is," replied Smike, shaking his head. "Shall I ever see your sister?" "To be sure you will," cried Nicholas. "We shall all be together one of these days when we're rich, Smike." "How is it that you, who are so kind and good to me, you have nobody to be kind and good to you?" said Smike. I cannot make that out." "Why, it's a long story," replied Nicholas, "and one you would have some difficulty in comprehending, I fear. I have an enemy." "I understand that." "Oh, yes, I understand that," said Smike. "Well, it is owing to him," returned Nicholas. "He is rich and not so easily punished as your old enemy, Mr. Squeers. He is my uncle, but he is a villain, and he has done me wrong."
"Has he, though?" asked Smike, bending eagerly forward. "What's his name? Tell me his name."
Ralph Nickleby."
Ralph Nickleby," repeated Smike. Ralph. I'll get that name by heart, I will.
He had muttered it over and over to himself some 20 times when a loud knock at the door disturbed him from his occupation. Before he could open it, Mr. Folair, the pantomimist, one of the actor company, thrust his head in. Mr. Folair's head was usually decorated with a very round, large hat, unusually high in the crown and curled up quite tight to the brim. On the previous occasion he wore it very much on one side, with the back part forward, and consequence of it being less rusty. Round his neck he wore a flaming red worsted comforter, whereof the straggling ends peeped out beneath his threadbare Newmarket coat, which was very tight and buttoned all the way up. He carried in his hand one very dirty glove and a cheap dress cane with a glass handle. In short, his whole appearance was unusually dashing, and demonstrated a far more serious, scrupulous attention to his toilet than he was in the habit of bestowing upon it. "Good evening," said Mr. Folair, taking off his hat and running his fingers through his hair. "I bring a communication." "From whom and about what?" inquired Nicholas. "You are unusually mysterious tonight." "Cold, perhaps," returned Mr. Folair. "Cold, perhaps. That is the fault of my position. Not of myself, Mr. Johnson. My position as a mutual friend requires it, sir." Mr. Folair paused with a most impressive look, and diving into the hat, before noticed, he drew from it a small piece of whitey brown paper curiously folded, whence he brought forth a note which it had served to keep clean, and standing over it, he gave it to Nicholas and said, "Have the goodness to read that, sir." Nicholas, in a state of much amazement, took the note and broke the seal, glancing at Mr. Folair as he did so, who, knitting his brow and pursing up his mouth with great dignity, was sitting with his eyes steadily fixed upon the ceiling. It was a note directed to Johnson, Esquire, by favour of Augustus Folair, Esquire. And the astonishment of Nicholas was in no degree lessened when he found it to be couched in the following laconic terms: "Mr. Lenville presents his kind regards to Mr. Johnson, and will feel obliged if he will inform him that at what hour tomorrow morning it would be most convenient to meet him, that is Mr. Lenville, at the theatre for the purpose of having his nose pulled in the presence of the company. Mr. Lenville requests Mr. Johnson not to neglect making an appointment, as he has invited 2 or 3 professional friends to witness the ceremony, and cannot disappoint them upon any account whatever. Portsmouth, Tuesday night." Indignant as he was at this impertinence, there was something so extraordinarily absurd in this cartel of defiance that Nicholas was obliged to bite his lip and read the note over and over again before he could muster sufficient gravity and sternness to address the hostile messenger, who had not taken his eyes from the ceiling, nor uttered an expression, or altered the expression of his face in the slightest degree. "Do you know the contents of this note?" asked Nicholas. "Yes," replied Mr. Folair, looking round for an instant and immediately carrying his eyes back again to the ceiling. "How dare you bring it here, sir?" said Nicholas, tearing it into little pieces and jerking it in a shower towards the messenger. "Have you no fear of being kicked downstairs, sir?" Mr. Folair turned his head, now ornamented with several of the fragments of the note, towards Nicholas, and with the same imperturbable dignity, briefly replied, "No." "Then," said Nicholas, taking up the tall hat and tossing it towards the door, "you had better follow that article of your dress, sir, or you will find yourself very disagreeably deceived, and I say that within a few dozen seconds." "I say, Mr. Johnson," remonstrated Mr. Folair, suddenly losing all his dignity, "none of that, you know. No tricks with a gentleman's wardrobe." "Leave the room," returned Nicholas. "How dare you presume to come here on such a ridiculous errand, you scoundrel?" said Mr. Folair, unwinding his comforter and gradually getting himself out of it. There, that's enough." "Enough!" cried Nicholas, advancing towards him. "Take yourself off, sir." I tell you," returned Mr. Folair, waving his hand in deprecation of any further wrath, I wasn't in earnest. It was only a joke." "Then you had better be careful how you indulge in such jokes again," said Nicholas, "or you will find yourself with an allusion to pulling noses, which it will probably be much more dangerous than anything in this note, of this facetious note. Who wrote it, by the way? And was it written in joke?" "Oh, no, that's the best of it," returned the actor. "It was written in earnest, honour bright, by Mr. Lenville." Nicholas could not express a smile at the odd figure before him, which at all times was most calculated to provoke mirth rather than anger, and was especially so at this moment, with one knee upon the ground. Mr. Folair twirled his old hat round in his hand, and affected the extremest agony lest any of the nap should have been knocked off, an ornament which it is almost superfluous to say it had not boasted for many months. "Come, sir," said Nicholas, laughing in spite of himself, "have the goodness to explain." "Why, I tell you how it is, sir," said Mr. Folair, sitting himself down in a chair in great coolness. "Since you came here, Mr. Lenville has done nothing but second business, and instead of having a reception every night as he used to have, they have let him come on as if he was a nobody." "What do you mean by a recognition?" said Nicholas. "Jupiter!" exclaimed Mr. Folair. "What an unsophisticated shepherd you are, Johnson! Why, applause from the house when you first come on. So he has got on night after night, never getting a hand, and you getting a couple of rounds at least, and sometimes 3, till at length he got quite desperate and half a mind to in the play last night, with a real sword, to pink you, not dangerously, but just enough to lay you by for a month or 2. "Oh, very considerate," remarked Nicholas. "Yes, I should say it was. Under what circumstances, his professional reputation being at stake," said Mr. Folair, quite seriously, "his heart failed him, and he is cast about for some other way of annoying you and making himself popular at the same time. For that's the point. Notoriety is the thing. Bless you, if he had pinked you," said Mr. Folair, stopping to make a calculation in his mind, "it would have been worth it would have been worth 8 or 10 shillings a week to him. All the town would have come to see the actor who nearly killed a man by mistake. I shouldn't wonder if it had got him an engagement in London. However, he was obliged to try some other mode of getting popular, as this one occurred to him. It's a clever idea, really. If you should show the white feather and refuse to go down to the theatre while he's there, and let him pull your nose, he'll have got it into the paper, and if you'd sworn the peace against him, he'd have got that into the paper too. Or he'd just been talking too much about you, don't you see?" "Oh, certainly," said Nicholas, But I suppose I were to turn the tables and pull his nose. What then? Would that make his fortune? Oh, why, no, I don't think it would, replied Mr. Folair, scratching his head, because there wouldn't be any romance about it, and he wouldn't have been favourably shown. To tell you the truth, though, he did calculate much upon that, for you're always so mild-spoken and always so popular amongst the ladies that we didn't suspect you of showing any fight. If you did, however, he would have had another way of getting out of it easily. Depend upon it. Ha ha! rejoined Nicholas. We will try tomorrow morning. In the meantime, you can give answer to whatever account of our interview you like the best. Good night. Mr. Folair was pretty well known amongst his fellow men as an actor who delighted in mischief and yet was by no means scrupulous. Nicholas had not much doubt that he had secretly prompted the tragedian in the course he had chosen, and moreover that he would have carried out his mission with a very high regard if he had not been concerted by the very unexpected demonstrations with which it had been received. It was not worth his while to be serious with him. However, so he dismissed the pantomimist, and with a gentle hint that if he offended again it would be under the penalty of a broken head, and Mr. Folair taking the caution in exceedingly great part, he walked away to confer with his principal, and give such an account of his proceedings as might be best calculated to carry on the joke. He had no doubt reported that Nicholas was in a state of extremely bodily fear, for when the young gentleman walked with much deliberation down to the theatre next morning at the usual hour, he found all the company assembled in evident expectation, and Mr. Lenville, with his severest stage face, sitting majestically on a table, whistling defiance. Now the ladies were on the side of Nicholas, and the gentlemen, being jealous, were on the side of the disappointed tragedian, so that the latter formed a little group about the redoubtable Mr. Lenville. On Nicholas stopping to salute them, Mr. Lenville laughed a scornful laugh, and made some general remark touching the natural history of puppies. "Oh," said Nicholas, quietly turning round, "are you there?" "Slave!" retorted Mr. Lenville, flourishing his right arm and approaching Nicholas with a theatrical stride. But somehow he appeared just at that moment to be a little startled, as if Nicholas didn't look quite so frightened as he had expected, and came all at once to an awkward halt, at which the assembled ladies burst into a shrill laugh. "Object of my scorn and hatred," said Mr. Lenville, "I hold ye in contempt." Nicholas laughed in a very unexpected way, because he was enjoying this performance, and the ladies, by word of encouragement, laughed even louder, whereat Mr. Lenville assumed his bitterest smile and expressed his opinion that they were minions. "But they shall not protect ye," said Mr. Lenville, taking an upward look at Nicholas, beginning from his boots and ending at the crown of his head, and then a downward one, beginning at the crown of his head and ending at his boots, which everyone knows expresses defiance on the stage. "They shall not protect ye, boy." Thus speaking, Mr. Lenville folded his arms and treated Nicholas to that expression of face with which in melodramatic performances he was in the habit of regarding the tyrannical king when they said, "Away with him to the deepest dungeon beneath the castle moat." and which, accompanied with a little jingling of fetters, had been known to produce great effects in its time. Whether it was the absence of the fetters or not, it made no very deep impression on Mr. Lenville's adversary, however, but rather seemed to increase the good humour expressed in his countenance, in which stage of the contest one or two of the gentlemen, who had come out expressly to witness the pulling of Nicholas' nose, grew impatient, murmuring that if it were to be done at all, it had better be done at once, and that if Mr. Lenville didn't mean to do it, he had better say so and not keep them waiting there. Thus urged, the tragedian adjusted the cuff of his right coat for the performance of the operation, and without the smallest discomposure walked towards Nicholas. Suddenly, Nicholas thrust out his fist and knocked him down. Before the discomfited tragedian could rise, some of his friends, and in particular Mrs. Lenville, who had been before hinted as being in an interesting state, rushed from the rear rank of ladies, and uttering a piercing scream, threw herself upon his body. "Do you see this monster? Do you see this?" cried Mr. Lenville, sitting up and pointing to his prostrate lady, who was holding him very tight around the waist. "Come," said Nicholas, nodding his head, "apologise for that insolent note you wrote last night, and waste no more time in talking." "Never!" cried Mr. Lenville. "Yes, yes, yes!" screamed his wife. "For my sake, for mine, Lenville, forgo all idle forms, unless you wish to see me blighted, a corpse at your feet." "This is very affecting," said Mr. Lenville, looking round him and drawing back his hand across his eyes. "The ties of nature are strong. The weak husband and father, the father that is yet to be, relents. I apologise." "Humbly and submissively," said Nicholas. "Humbly and submissively," said the tragedian, scowling upwards. "But only to save her." "For a time will come." "Very good," said Nicholas. "I hope Mr. Lenville may have a good one. And when it does come, and you are a father, you shall retract all this nonsense if you have the courage. There, be careful, sir, to what lengths your jealousy carries you another time, and be careful of your rival's temper." And with this parting advice, Nicholas picked up Mr. Lenville's ash stick, which had flown out of his hand, and breaking it in half, threw him the pieces, and withdrew. The profoundest deference was paid to Nicholas that night, and all the people who had been most anxious to have his nose pulled in the morning embraced occasions of taking him aside and telling him with great feeling how very friendly they took it that he should have been treated and should have treated Lenville so properly, who was the most unbearable fellow, and upon whom they had all, by one remarkable coincidence, at one time or another, contemplated the infliction of condign punishment, which they had only been restrained from administering by considerations of mercy. Indeed, to judge from the invariable termination of all these stories, there never was such a charitable and kind-hearted set of people as the male members of Mr. Crunnell's company. Nicholas bore his triumph, as he had his success in the little world of the theatre, with the utmost moderation and good humour. The crestfallen Mr. Lenville made an expiring effort to obtain revenge by sending a boy into the gallery to hiss, but he fell a sacrifice to popular indignation, and was promptly turned out without having his money back. "Well," said Smike, as Nicholas, the first piece over, had almost finished before dressing to go home. Is there any letter yet?
Do you know, I believe there is, said Nicholas. Oh yes, of course, replied Smike. I got the letter from the post office today, didn't I?
It's from Newman Noggs, said Nicholas, casting his eye upon the cramped direction. It's no easy matter to make out his writing. Let me see. By dint of poring over the letter for half an hour, he contrived to make himself master of its contents, which were certainly not a matter to set his mind at ease. Newman took upon himself to send back the £10, observing that he had ascertained that neither Mrs. Nickleby nor Kate was in actual need of money, and that a time might come quite shortly when Nicholas might want it more. He entreated him not to be alarmed at what he was about to say. There was no bad news. They were both in good health, but he thought the circumstances might occur or were occurring which would render it absolutely necessary for Kate to have her brother's protection, and if so, Newman said, he would write to him to that effect, either by the next post or the next one. Nicholas read this passage very often, and the more he thought of it, the more he began to fear that there was some treachery going on the part of Ralph. Once or twice he felt tempted to repair to London at all hazards, leaving all hazards behind him without an hour's delay, but a little reflection assured him that if such a step was necessary, Newman would have spoken about it and told him when to come. At all events, I should prepare for the possibility of my going away suddenly, said Nicholas. I should lose no time in doing that. As the thought occurred to him, he took up his hat and hurried to the green room. Mr. Johnson, said Mrs. Crummles, who had seated herself there in full regal costume, with the phenomenon as a maiden in her maternal arms, and herself dressed like a gorgeous empress. Next week for Ryde, then for Winchester, then for... I'm sorry for that, returned Nicholas. Before you can... please do not go any further before you hear that my career here may very well soon come to an end. Come to an end? Cried Mrs. Crummles, raising her hands in astonishment. Come to an end? Cried Miss Snevellicci, trembling so much in her tights that she actually laid her hand upon the shoulder of the manageress for support. Why, he don't mean to say that he's going, exclaimed Mrs. Grudden, making her way towards Mrs. Crummles. Hoity-toity nonsense. The phenomenon, being of an affectionate nature and moreover excitable, raised a loud cry, and Miss Belvawney and Miss Bravassa actually shed tears. Even the male members of the troupe stopped in their conversation and echoed the word going, although some of their congratulations, given in the loudest of voices, were not very sincere, as they winked at each other, as though they would not be sorry to lose such a favoured rival. An opinion, indeed, which the honest Mr. Folair was ready to subscribe to himself, and he only stated it in so many words to a demon with whom he was sharing a pot of porter. Nicholas briefly said that he feared it might be so, and although he could not yet speak with any degree of certainty, and getting away as fast as he could, he went home on Newman's letter to think about it and gaze at it again and again and speculate upon it afresh. How trifling all that had been, occupying his mind and thoughts for many works, seemed to him during that sleepless night, and how constantly and incessantly present to observe his imagination was the one idea was that Kate was in the midst of some great trouble and offence, and that he must go home and look for Kate and his mother, because the danger was coming not only to them, but to them as well.